I am very happy to be doing this next podcast, and it's going to cover one of my favorite topics, and that is the Nephilim. And again, I have two very interesting people on the podcast, Pastor Carel Smith and Dr. Willie McLeod, and I'm really interested to see how we're going to navigate this topic. There's a couple of things that I would like to cover, if Willie's okay with that. The one is, what is the Nephilim? And I think it's really good to clarify that right off the bat, because some of our listeners might not be that knowledgeable on it. And then the next thing that I would love us to cover is just looking at where the Nephilim is presented in the Bible. One of the very prominent places is in Genesis 6, verse 4. And the verse actually starts off by saying, and the Nephilim were on the earth in those days. So I think that's quite important to identify that, and just to sort of emphasize the fact that it's not mythology that's now suddenly making its way into the Bible. I would also like to talk about the relationship between the Nephilim and the Benai Elohim. I think that's really important. And Willie, who's very knowledgeable on Sumerian, can I call it myth and mythology, history, to sort of go into the Sumerian background of the Nephilim, the Egyptian, and then the Hurrian as well. So, and just as it relates to the fallen seed. And then lastly, one of my favorite characters, Gilgamesh or Gilgamesh. But before the podcast started, I had a quick little chat with Carel, and I'm going to throw him under the bus. And he's got a specific question for Willie. So, Carel, over to you.
Thanks, Lubay. It's always such a joy to talk about these interesting things, and especially we find it in the Bible and how it touches our faith. So, but I'm not the specialist. My dear brother Willie is. So, Willie, maybe you can start by saying something. Why would the Nephilim be important, and why is it good to look into this subject?
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be with you guys again today. And here in South Africa, it's quite cold, but this is a very nice topic for discussion. Now, the Nephilim, they are only mentioned twice in the Bible. And the one is, you've just read it, the Bay. It's in Genesis 6, verse 4. I just want to draw attention to this verse. There were giants. Now, Nephilim here, it's been translated giants, on the earth in those days, and also afterward. Now, this is important because this refers to the days before the flood and also afterwards. So it was not only before the flood or the great deluge, it was also after the flood that they were on the earth. When the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them, those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. Now, so this is the one place where we find a reference, and then the other place is in Numbers, Numbers 13, verse 3. And here we read how the spies, the Hebrew spies, when they entered the land of Canaan, they encountered these beings. And here we read, there we saw the giants, Nephilim. So it's again been translated giants. And then it continues, the descendants of Enoch came from the giants. Now it's another word that's been used that's really referring to giants. And we were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight. So they are described here as having been giants. This is also in Genesis, it has been translated in that way. In both cases, they are closely connected with giants. The question is, however, if the Nephilim should only be linked with giants. Now, in my way of thinking, this is not the case. They should not only be linked with giants, because the word actually means something different. slightly different. So although they are described in this passage in Numbers as giants, the word actually comes from Napal, which means to fall. And Nephilim had been taken to mean the fella, the bully, the tyrant, or then also possibly giant by certain authorities. But others interpret this word as meaning fallen ones, or the ones who have fallen. And this interpretation arises from the fact that the sons of God, about whom we'll be talking tonight again, or today also, is then taken to be fallen beings, fallen angels who had these children with the daughters of men. And as such, they were squens of these fallen angels. So the idea of fallen ones, but at the same time also bullies or tyrants or heroes, actually, is also a good translation. So these are all terms that have been used. The question, Carel, that you've asked is, why are they important? Well, the Bible do not really say a lot about them. But why, should we ask? Does they in any way feature in the Bible? Why are they referred to if they are not important? So I believe what we have is a certain kind of background information towards the biblical story. So there's a story behind the biblical story. The Bible just tells us the basic story, God's engagement with humans throughout history, and the story about God's salvation, Jesus dying for us on the cross, who have died on the cross for our sins and brought salvation. This is the main theme, and this is the biblical story. But behind the scenes, there's another story. And this is a larger story about the fallen angels, about Lucifer, and also this very strange encounter of the fallen angels having had children with the daughters of men, and these people having been on the earth not only before the deluge, but also after the deluge. So if they were after the deluge, well, they might be quite important. And I think the main obstacle to a true and a correct understanding is that people take the Nephilim only in terms of giants.
Yes.
So they interpret the Nephilim only as giants. They read the word as giants, and this is wrong in my opinion. So in my view, they did include what we would call giants, but that's wrong to include, to say that all Nephilim were giants. I don't think so. I don't believe that's true. And especially from my studies regarding extra biblical traditions, because the Nephilim is not confined to the Bible. The Bible refers to them, but we find a lot of tradition, a lot of stories, and a rich tradition about them outside the Bible and extra biblical sources going back to ancient Sumer. So I believe they are important because there's a story behind the everyday telling of the gospel. And that story has not been forgotten. That's why it's been referred to.
And I think when you talk about the giants, them not only featuring as giants, you're referring to the dwarves as well, and there's quite a few prominent ones that in the past we've talked about.
Well, you see, the word Nephilim actually also means heroes.
Yes.
And in this particular passage, it's been in Genesis, we read that those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. So it's men of renown. Gilgamesh was a man of renown. We'll talk about him later on. But in the ancient world, some of the greatest kings of ancient times were regarded as, from a biblical perspective, Nephilim.
People like Lugalbanda.
Yeah, so some very great kings, Lugalbanda goes back to the Uruk period, but later kings, for example, the Akkadian kings, Sargon, Afakat,
Yep.
Naram-Sin, the first person who believed himself to being a god, and he was worshipped as a god, just like the other great gods in ancient Sumer. Now, they were regarded as Nephilim, using the biblical terminology. In the ancient world, obviously, this terminology were not used. They used different terms and different ways to refer to the same thing, but they were regarded as descendants of the gods, of the great gods. So they are a lineage of great kings, mighty and great warriors from ancient times, which were not necessarily giants. Giants were also part of the story, but in my view, giants only forms a small part of the story. The larger part of the story relates to others that's not been regarded as giants, but were mighty and great heroes.
Yes. So, Willie, my next question is, there seems to be a tendency, and before this we had a little conversation. There seems to be the tendency to try and almost negotiate away this supernatural, situation that took place with the sons of God and the daughters of men. And one of these sort of approaches is the Sethian approach, and it does get taught in some seminaries. Where did that originate, and what are your opinion around that? That it's not necessarily supernatural beings, but just the sons of Seth.
Yeah, that view goes back to the 4th century. Before the 4th century, that view didn't exist. And the way that in earlier times this had been interpreted, it's actually quite simple. Sons of God is a very old term. We find it, for example, in the Uyghur texts that goes back to about 1400 BC, where they appear as sons of El.
Yes.
So the sons of El, or the sons of God, that's a very old term that's been used for the gods. The sons of the main god, or the father of the gods, which in the Semitic tradition translates to El. It's also been found in the Sumerian tradition, where they are referred to as the Anuna or the Anunnaki.
Yes.
Now, Anuna means very much the same. It means the seed or the sons of Nun. Now, Nun means prince, and the prince, in the more general way of understanding these things, go back to the supreme god An, which is we've talked about this on earlier programs, but it's the equivalent, the Sumerian equivalent of the god El, also being regarded as the father of the gods. So the Anuna or Anunnaki is the Sumerian equivalent of the sons of El of the Uyghur texts, or the sons of God in the biblical text, which is actually that's not the only passage where we find it. We find it in many other passages, but that's an old terminology. And we find in the Septuagint, now the Septuagint, that's the Greek translation of the Hebrew text, which had been made in about the 3rd century BC, as before Christ, so about 250 BC, especially this passage in Genesis goes back to that time. And in that case, it's been translated as angels. So there can be no doubt that the early Jews actually understood that as angels, because at first the term gods were generally used. But slowly but steadily in Hebrew circles, the term angel came to replace the earlier, older terminology of gods, sons of God, for example, and they became known as angels. And the differentiation was made between the angels following God and the other gods. But at first, all these beings were just called gods.
Yes, absolutely.
I have a question, if it is all right, Levi.
Yes, please go ahead.
This amazing text in the Bible, which actually summarizes just in a few words, Willie, as you have mentioned, this bigger story behind the Bible, Genesis 6 verse 4. I'm quickly going to read it again. The Nephilim were on earth in those days and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of man and they bore children to them. You've written 2 articles which I've read. And what is quite amazing in those articles is, many times you read the Bible and you wonder, but how did it happen? Do we not have some more light or more information about this very brief description? And in those articles you've written, there's quite amazing material out of the Sumerian history and other histories, how this could have happened. So that was very interesting for me. If you can mention something about that.
Yeah, so the idea of fallen gods, that's where the conversation actually starts. It goes back before the Nephilim. Because the Nephilim simply reflects the fallen nature of their parentage of the fallen angels. So the story goes back to the fallen angels. And throughout the Bible, there are various different kinds of references to the fallen angels, and especially also towards Satan as the fallen one, the adversary in the council of the gods. But this is actually a very ancient tradition. So the story about the fallen angels or the fallen gods, that's actually one of the oldest stories ever told. That's fascinating.
It is.
It's a tradition that we can trace back before the deluge. Now, I've already in previous conversations said that I regard the deluge as the event that corresponds in Sumerian terms with the flood layer that divides the earlier Ubaid period from the later Uruk period. We've had a whole discussion the previous time about the deluge. I won't go back there. But there can be no doubt that these traditions go back before that time, before the deluge, in accordance with what the Bible says here, that these things happened already in the time before the Great Flood. So this is an extremely old and ancient tradition about the fallen gods. There are various ways that the story had been told in previous times. We can say in a kind of myth form, because that's the way that things about the gods were recounted. And for example, about seed that fell on the ground, or the main god. There's even talk about the rebellion, very much similar to the biblical description, which is much later, about the rebellion of Satan and his angels against God. And we'll read in Revelation now, chapter 12, about Satan, which has thrown a third of the stars onto the ground. It's usually interpreted as angels that followed him, but throwing them on the ground is a very interesting expression, because this is exactly the kind of terminology that we find from the earliest of times for the seed that had fallen on the ground during this rebellion against the rule of the supreme God, called An in the Sumerian tradition. An simply means the Most High God, which is the equivalent of El, the Father of the gods. So there was a rebellion in the heavenly sphere, and this rebellion was remembered from the earliest of times, long before our earliest written histories. When we come to the time where we have written texts, that tradition was already well established. It was much older than that period.
And sorry, go ahead, Willie.
So when these things happened in the celestial skies, obviously it's filtered down and it became known throughout the ancient world, and it was delivered throughout the ancient world in various forms and myths and stories. So it's not unique to the Bible, and that's quite important, because that tells us the Bible has not been written in its isolation. The story about the Bible and the things that happened is not confined to the Bible. It goes back to a general ancient perspective on the world, on the supreme God, about the gods. So this is the history of religion and the history of the gods, and the biblical story is consistent with what we find in the ancient world.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add to that as well as, I mean, there's extra biblical sources that actually references Mount Hermon or Ramon as the place of descent, and also to specific fallen angels, and they actually get listed name by name by name. So it all
you see
together.
What you are referring to is the Book of Watchers. Now, the Book of Watchers had been included in the Book of Enoch, the first book of Enoch, chapters 1 to 36. And in this Book of Watchers, which goes back to about the 3rd century BC, so that's about the same time that the Septuagint had been translated. We hear about these watchers and these sons, these fallen angels that came down on Mount Hermon in the north, towards the north of Israel, and their progeny were the giants. And then we read that the giants were responsible for the corruption in the world in the antediluvian age, and how they in various ways has corrupted men. In the days of Jared, the father of Enoch, it said that 200 angels or watchers under the leadership of Ashael and Shemazah became attached to the daughters of men, and then they descended. And then we also read how they teach the men certain celestial secrets, including knowledge about magic arts like magical medicine, using charms, spells, cutting of roots and plants, technological knowledge about the discovery and working of metals to produce weaponry, bracelets, other adornments for women, as well as knowledge of astronomy, astrology, meteorology, including the study of the clouds and cosmography. So all these things, these innovations, in fact, resulted in violence, warfare, and sexual promiscuity. And these things, according to the book of Enoch, is then traced back to the angels, to the fallen angels who have taught these things to their squires, their sons, the Nephilim. And they spread these doctrines, these secret doctrines and mysteries throughout the ancient world, which in effect would then be standing in opposition. It's actually the occult stream, the occult tradition, the secret tradition of the mysteries. And many of the things being stated in the book of Enoch corresponds with what we find in Greek tradition regarding certain, let's call it angelic beings, but given other names like Dactyli or Kavirai or whatsoever, different names. But the tradition that's been sketched in the book of Enoch, or the book of the Watchers, is basically this. It corresponds closely with what we find in Greek tradition throughout the ancient world. So it's not too difficult to pinpoint what they're talking about.
And I just wanted to add to that is when we reference Enoch, there's actually 2 different Enochs. So there's Enoch and Enoch 1, and then Enoch the evil. But something that I just wanted to ask you about as well is, so sometimes we have this image of, I actually had someone tell me that she doesn't believe in the Old Testament because her God wouldn't have flooded the world and killed off children and women and that kind of thing. Now, if you look at the flood, do you think there's any credibility to the opinion that the flood occurred because of the Nephilim, and part of that purpose was to wipe them out? And if you talk about genetic purity, it was basically destroying the impure.
Yeah, so I think if one reads in Genesis how the flood came about, we read, for example, how the people became more and more violent. And this is sort of the background towards the flood story. So this story in Genesis chapter 6 gives the background as to why the flood actually occurred. So it's already mentioned right in the beginning there in 6 verse 1, we find now it came to pass when man began to multiply on the face of the earth and the daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men and that they were beautiful. And they took wives for them of all whom they choose. That's actually verse 1 and 2. And the Lord said, my spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. And then the idea here is my spirit shall not strive with man forever. I think the context there is given in verse 5. Then the Lord saw the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. So this violence and all the things we've spoken about, from the biblical perspective, the reason why the world had become so violent and in rebellion against God and all these things was a direct result of the fallen angels, their impact on history, and also the Nephilim. So from this perspective, given in Genesis 6, so often we just read this passage and we would just say, okay, it was violent times and people were sinful and so forth and so forth. But in this passage, it's quite clear that the main reason behind all these things were the Nephilim and the fallen angels. And they were the main reason, the reason behind the reason for the flood, for what happened during the deluge.
Yes.
Carel, what do you think about that perspective? It's not usually what one hears. One usually just hear in terms of the sinfulness, but of mankind in the time before the flood. But clearly in Genesis, there's a different perspective.
I was wondering, stop me if this is not within the scope of this conversation, but, I've read about the so-called sacred marriage ritual. It was very interesting how these fallen angels, how they produced in the end a human, what is a nageslag? Descent. And you've also used the word incarnate at some stage. And now it's very interesting, if you think that there were these two seeds, two lines, bloodlines, the war between the seeds, and why would it be so important for Satan and the fallen angels to incarnate themselves into mankind and to drive a certain goal they want to reach on earth? And later on, God sent his own son, Jesus Christ, and he was also God incarnated, but the holy living God. And it's also nicely described, in the book of Revelation with the dragon and the lamb. All these things, talking about a bigger story, it describes this war going on between these two big kingdoms. But, it is interesting that Satan also, through his fallen angels, incarnated the earth. And, I don't know if the fallen are still here with us somehow. I don't know, but it's very interesting.
That's a brilliant question.
Yeah, what you're mentioning is fascinating. I think this comes to the main thrust of the story. So in Genesis, we read about two seeds. Now already in chapter 3, two seeds, the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman. Yes. And we read about an eternal enmity between them. And in my way of thinking, in my studies over many years, I've been studying this topic for more than 25 years. I've actually written some books and on the Nephilim. So this is to me a fascinating topic. But what is interesting in the ancient period, you've mentioned the sacred marriage. Now, in the temple hymn of the temple of Kesh, we read how the priests were called Anunnaki gods, the priests. And then later on, especially regarding Gilgamesh, we read how the high priest engendered him on the king's daughter, but in the form of a spirit. Now, the Lilu spirit is a certain kind of spirit. So it seems, if we take all the information together, that there was an opinion that somehow that spirit came to possess the high priest, and then through the high priest, that spirit fathered this child, Gilgamesh. And in later periods, and in later periods, also, for example, Herodotus mentions in his histories that even in Babylonian times, it was practiced to take a virgin girl and set her apart for the god in the temple. That originally that was in the temple of Inanna, where she was set apart, and this practice goes back to Sumerian times. But in Sumerian times, she was not only set apart for the god, the priest, in this case, in Gilgamesh's case, it was Lugalbanda. He was a great shaman. And he came to her, and he was possessed by this spirit, or from other sources we've already mentioned. We could possibly also connect these spirits with the Anunnaki spirits which possessed him, and through him, Gilgamesh was fathered. So
yeah, I just want to add to that, just sort of interject it. It features in our modern times as well. There's a very popular movie by Bruce Willis called The Fifth Element, and it's this woman that ends up being the savior of the world, supposed to be the savior of the world, and her name is Lilu, or Lilitu.
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, I thought you were going to refer to Rosemary's Baby, but...
not yet.
Yeah. So clearly those motives are still current, and I believe that Naram's sin were actually the equivalent in this other tradition of Jesus Christ coming later on in the Christian tradition. So we have two traditions, two stories. The one is God and the angels going with God. The other is the fallen angels. And in both cases, in the case of the fallen gods, they engendered sons and daughters, and there came a line, a lineage from that time. And it was not only before the deluge, but also afterwards. And great kings were born from this lineage, and Naram Sin himself being regarded as a god, a great god. And he was celebrated for centuries afterwards and worshipped in the cult, very much like we worship Jesus Christ. But in the other side of the equation, we do not have a lineage, but we have the same thing, that God incarnated, or became incarnated in Jesus Christ. He was also born from a virgin, supernaturally conceived, and he was the Son of God. He was divine. But the difference is, on the one hand, we have an earthly line, lineage, descendant. And I believe that eventually when the Antichrist will arise on the scene, he will be from this very lineage. So we have two traditions, we have two stories, but the story about the Nephilim is extremely important important because it's not only related to a long forgotten past, it's also relevant to our own day.
It's two parallel stories that run, and the one's the real story, and the other one is the duplicate or the copy. I have one other question, because I think Carel might want to ask something as well. Is that okay? So we have this this situation with the Benai Elohim. We have the flood or the deluge, and then there seems to have been a second insurrection, if I can call it that. So I mean, if the purpose of the flood was to wipe out the impure bloodline, do you have any thoughts around that second interaction? Or because the Bible clearly says they were there before and after the flood. Any sort of comments around that?
Yeah, yeah, Carel, you're welcome.
If we look at the bigger picture, the war going on between light and darkness, maybe it was not to wipe them out, but just to stop them or to hold them back for a time or a season.
That's probably one of the best answers I've heard. Yes. Yeah.
I think that's a good answer. So often, you know, this is the case because things evolve in a certain way. And if the flood did not happen at that stage in history, it might have happened that the Messiah, the true Messiah, wouldn't have been able to come because of circumstances, and they've been they taking over the world, and the other lineage being totally extinguished. So I believe, exactly as Carel said, that throughout history, one of the main things to understand is some things happened that is actually related to things that later on became important. So I believe you're 100% correct, Carel. This is also what I think. It was although at that stage God has brought his judgment over the earth through the deluge, we read that at the end of days he will again bring his judgment. But he, in a certain sense, he gained time. Because after the deluge, it took some time for them to reorganize. There's a lot of tradition. I believe that the main feature here is the Tower of Babel, and we'll talk about that next week, next time, I believe.
And the interesting Nimrod.
Yeah, and those events, I believe, were exactly the events that led to the reincarnation of these gods on earth, these Nephilim gods. And I've done a lot of study on that, and there's a lot of detail available. So I believe that was the historical situation when they re-entered history. And after that, we find lineages that was believed to have been descended from the gods. And some of these lineages also we find in Greek history called demigods, Hercules, for example, Perseus. But we can trace them back. For example, Perseus is just the Greek Gilgamesh. It's nothing else than the Greek Gilgamesh. And Hercules is none but Naram Sin. It's just been that those traditions had been handed down, and after a long period of time, the Greeks came to know them, and they called him Hercules. But actually, before his name was Hercules in Greek circles, it was Alcius, which means the strong. And Naram Sin was called after his great victory in the rebellion. It was after that great victory that he was worshipped as a god. He was called the strong. That was his name.
Yes. Yeah.
His title. Yeah.
So Willie, just one other question. I can keep on going for the next 2 hours, but anyway, Sodom and Gomorrah. Some people seem to have the opinion that were Nephilim cities. Do you have any thoughts around that and any comments?
Yeah, that's quite an interesting comment.
Curveball.
There's quite a lot of information available on that also. You see, what we read about is a group that's called the Sons of Seth, that actually were located in the region of Seir in Moab, in that whole region from what's later been known as the Dead Sea and that whole region.
Yes.
And we read about this Seth actually could also be translated as tumult. And in the book of Numbers, they are referred to. And here we, for example, read in Balaam's prophecy regarding the Messiah, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, a scepter shall rise out of Israel, and batter the brow of Moab, and destroy all the sons of Seth. And Edom shall be a possession, Seir also his enemies shall be a possession. So here, this tradition has also been preserved by Josephus. And there's a long story regarding this, which I can't go into now. But so you're 100% correct. There's a strong tradition about the Nephilim having been settled or in earlier times in that region. And that might be related to the story of Sodom and Gomorrah.
And I like the fact that you've referenced Josephus as well, because I think it's really important for, people that ask, how trustworthy is the Gospels and the Bible, that, Josephus is an extra biblical source that you can actually go to. And he references quite a number of really interesting things. I'm not going to go into all of the details, but that's a very, very good point. I'm happy that we've scratched the surface today. So
maybe Levi, I have just one more question, if I may.
Please, absolutely.
Something that I perceive is this very interesting trend that through history, these stories about these heroes or figures are reoccurring. They are kept alive.
They are.
And Willie, you said something happened in the heavenlies and the ancients knew it. So how did they get that knowledge? It seems maybe through the shamans or so, that every now and then a new story is produced in a new tradition, but it links back. So it seems there's a supernatural push to keep these traditions alive. And also, to see the bigger picture, even though it's out of the side of darkness. But you mentioned the Greeks and the Greek gods being the same as these other gods. So that's a very interesting trend I perceive. How
Carel,
did they get that knowledge?
Yeah, I just wanted to add something to that as well, Carel. I think it's sort of applicable. Is if you look at Nimrod, for instance, that we'll discuss later, I think that was the first version of transhumanism. And currently there's a huge push towards transhumanism as well. But anyway, Willie, back to you.
Yeah, just to come back to the point that Carel mentioned. So we can talk about the age of ignorance. So before God revealed himself to the extent that he did to Moses, for example, and we have in the Pentateuch. Before that, but let's take the Abrahamic times. Even the time of Moses, because here Balaam is in the story. Now, Balaam is a strange figure. On the one hand, he's a prophet, because he prophesied about the Messiah, the coming of the Messiah. But on the other hand, he's a magician. So this is an earlier period which is very difficult for us to understand. Because God had not yet at that stage been revealed to the extent that he had been in what we read in the Bible. The Bible originated with Moses. Before Moses, the Bible did not exist. I believe there was source material that were handed down in the family of Abraham. There was a long tradition going back. But even in the Pentateuch, we read that the forefathers of the Abrahamic family worshipped false gods in the land from which they originated. So what we find, and what is extremely important, is that there was before the period in which we have the Bible, from the time of Moses, about 1400 BC, there were an earlier period. And at that stage, people had they didn't have the kind of information available to us today. They had not, God had not yet revealed himself to that extent. So there were a lot of ignorance during that period. Now, when it comes to the fall, I believe all the spiritual beings throughout the spiritual realm were aware of that. It was a kind of spiritual fact. So it's not strange to find it outside the Bible in ancient traditions, because it's like a general knowledge regarding the spiritual world that had been handed down. So that's the way that I understand it. Yes.
It was handed down through the fallen spirits.
Yeah, so what I'm saying is that, not the story about the fallen spirits were well known in ancient times. And people that engaged with the spiritual realm, at first probably shamans, people like Balaam, Enoch, for example, we read that he went to heaven and he had a close relationship with God. So these things were revealed at a very early stage, and we should not expect them only to have been revealed to the biblical people, the people of God, because the others also knew about it. It was general knowledge about these events that happened in the spiritual world. So that's the way that I understand it, how these things, these myths and stories had traveled all over the ancient world. It was not something, as we read in the New Testament, that happened in a corner.
Yes, right.
So Willie, these themes seem to, and sort of Carel mentioned that as well, these themes seem to keep resurfacing. Do you think there's an active push towards having these things resurface, or do you think there's some form of spiritual or global consciousness that tends to move into that direction?
Good question.
The Nephilim is back in the news. Let me tell you, if you just have an eye, you'll see it in the media, especially in various kinds of productions, films, etc. So they are truly back, and I think they're back as a theme because the people that believe themselves to be Nephilim, to be descendants of the gods, they are operative in our times. And the myth makers that accompany them throughout the ages, they actively busy pushing the story, and so this is why it's in the news again. Yeah. So this is not a story that's only goes back to the time before the delusion, directly afterwards during the Tower of Babel. It's a story that evolved through the ages and unfolded, and to this day, it's now currently busy unfolding. And I believe that the Antichrist will be from this lineage in fact, I believe there's a good reason to believe that it's not only the angels in general that left descendants on earth. I believe that Satan himself could have produced such a line, such a seed. And I think this is actually what we read about, the seed of the snake. Yes. In Genesis chapter 3.
The cosmic clock is ticking.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Carel, do you have one final question or
a
final
comment from a theological perspective?
Yes.
Yeah, maybe I can just say this. I think we are extremely ignorant about these things. It is in the Bible. It is happening. So thank you, Willie, for helping us to see a clearer picture of this ancient conflict, which is just as real in our own days. And just once again, underlining the fact that the Bible is an amazing book, also having a prophetic word for the future and for the big clock that's ticking on, as you've said. Lebain. Yeah, I think
Thank you.
that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Carel. My final thought is just, it seems that in a certain sense, we're back in the age of ignorance. Perhaps Willie wants to write a book called Scientism and the Age of Ignorance. I don't know, that might be a good topic for you to cover, but I really want to thank you guys. I think this has been a really nice, lively conversation. And for the listeners, I just wanted to say that we've literally just scratched the surface. So there's more to come. It's a really, really interesting topic and well worth studying, because the story of the Nephilim is, in a certain sense, the story of us, if I can put it that way. And just the final thought is that this will be posted on the Core Ideas site, as well as the Bible GPS site as well. And we also have our YouTube channel, but everything will be posted or linked at the bottom of the podcast. So thanks for listening. And Carel and Willie, thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. It was fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lebain.
My pleasure.
Bless you.